The frigid Montana wind howled outside the cabin, but inside, Grace Whitaker remained untouched by its chill as she sat motionless beside the empty bed where her husband had taken his last breath just 3 days prior. Her slender fingers traced the outline of his pillow, still bearing the indentation of his head, as if the cotton and feathers refused to forget him even as his body lay cold in the ground behind their homestead. Montana Territory, 1883. A place where life and death danced together in cruel, unpredictable patterns. Grace had known this when she'd followed Thomas Whitaker west from Philadelphia 5 years earlier, stars in her eyes and hope in her heart. Now, at 26, she was alone with 40 acres, a small herd of cattle, and memories that offered no warmth against the approaching winter. A knock at the door startled her from her reverie. She hadn't heard a horse approach. Strange, considering the silence that enveloped her property like a shroud. Mrs. Whitaker. The voice was deep, steady. A man's voice she didn't immediately recognize. Grace smoothed her black morning dress and opened the door to find Jackson Garrett standing on her porch, hat in hand. His tall frame blocked the setting sun, casting a long shadow across her threshold. She knew him only in passing one of the cowboys who worked at the Henderson ranch that bordered her property to the north. He'd tipped his hat to her in town once or twice, perhaps exchanged pleasantries at church socials before Thomas fell ill. "Mr. Garrett," she acknowledged, her voice sounding hollow to her own ears. "What brings you here?" "Madam, I came to pay my respects," he said, his blue eyes solemn beneath the brim of his hat, "and to offer my help." Word reached the ranch about Thomas. Grace nodded stiffly. "Thank you, but I'm managing." Jackson's gaze traveled past her to the interior of the cabin, lingering on the empty bed visible through the doorway to the bedroom. His expression softened. "No disrespect intended, Mrs. Whitaker, but winter's coming fast this year. Your north fence needs mending before the first heavy snow, and I noticed your woodpiles running low." He shifted his weight, the leather of his boots creaking. "Henderson sent me to help, said a neighbor ought to look after a neighbor." Grace's pride warred with practicality. Thomas had been sick for months before pneumonia finally took him. The ranch had suffered from his absence long before his death. "I can pay," she said quickly. "No need," Jackson replied. "Consider it neighborly duty." Before she could protest further, a gust of wind nearly took the door from her grasp. Jackson reached out, his calloused hand steadying the oak panel. His proximity startled her. She hadn't stood this close to any man besides Thomas in years. "At least come in for coffee," Grace offered, propriety winning out over her desire for solitude. "It's the least I can do if you're offering to help." The cowboy ducked his head as he entered, removing his hat entirely. His dark hair was longer than most, curling slightly at the nape of his neck. Grace noticed the way his shoulders filled his worn denim jacket, the careful way he wiped his boots before stepping onto her clean-swept floor. "I appreciate that, Mrs. Whitaker." He settled into a chair at her small table as she moved to the stove to stoke the fire. "Please call me Grace," she said, her back to him as she measured coffee into the pot. "Mrs. Whitaker makes me sound like my mother-in-law." A small smile touched Jackson's lips. "Grace, then, and I'm Jackson to my friends." The coffee bubbled and boiled as an awkward silence fell between them. Grace found herself grateful for the simple task of preparing the drinks. It gave her hands something to do, her eyes somewhere to look besides the handsome stranger in her kitchen. "How long were you married?" Jackson asked as she placed a steaming cup before him. 5 years, Grace answered, sitting across from him. "We came out from Philadelphia in '78. Jackson nodded. "That was a hard winter," it was. "But Thomas had dreams of building something of our own." Her voice caught. He was determined. "And now?" Jackson asked gently. Grace stared into her cup. "Now I have 40 acres, 18 head of cattle, and no idea what I'm doing." The admission slipped out before she could stop it. Jackson didn't immediately respond. When Grace finally looked up, she found him studying her with an intensity that made her cheeks warm. "You have options," he said finally. "You could sell, return east to your family." "I have no family left in Philadelphia," Grace replied. "This land is all I have now." Jackson took a long sip of his coffee. "Then we'd better get that fence fixed before the snow comes." True to his word, Jackson returned the next morning with tools and materials loaded on his horse. Grace watched from the porch as he set to work on the north fence, his movements efficient and practiced. By midday, she'd brought him water and a simple lunch of bread and cold beef. "You don't have to do this," she said as he wiped sweat from his brow despite the autumn chill. "I know," he replied simply, taking the offered plate, "but someone should." They fell into a routine over the following days. Jackson would arrive at dawn and work until dusk, repairing fences, chopping wood, and checking on the cattle. Grace found herself watching the clock, anticipating his arrival each morning. His presence brought life back to the homestead that had felt like a tomb since Thomas's passing. On the seventh day, a Sunday, Jackson didn't show. Grace told herself she wasn't disappointed as she donned her black dress and bonnet for church in town. She hitched her wagon alone, the task taking twice as long without Jackson's help, and set off for the small wooden church that served as the heart of the community. The service was a blur. Grace sat in her usual pew, aware of the pitying glances cast her way by the other women. A widow at her age was an object of both sympathy and speculation in a territory where unmarried women were scarce. As she was leaving, Pastor Miller caught her arm. "Grace, I'm glad to see you here today. How are you holding up?" "As well as can be expected, Pastor," she replied, the words practiced and hollow. "I've heard Jackson Garrett's been helping around your place," he said, his expression kind but concerned. "A good man, Jackson, but people talk, you understand, a young widow alone with a single man." Heat flooded Grace's face. "It's not like that, Pastor, he's simply being neighborly." Of course. The pastor patted her hand. "Still, propriety must be observed even in difficult times." Grace nodded stiffly and hurried to her wagon, mortification burning in her chest. She hadn't considered how Jackson's presence might be perceived. In her grief and isolation, the thought hadn't crossed her mind. She was halfway home when she spotted a rider approaching from the direction of her property. Jackson's broad-shouldered silhouette was unmistakable even at a distance. He slowed his horse as they drew alongside each other on the narrow road. "I thought you might be at church," he said by way of greeting. "I went by to check on that heifer that was looking poorly." "How is she?" Grace asked, grateful for the practical topic. "Better. The tonic I gave her yesterday seems to have helped." He studied her face. "You look troubled." Grace hesitated, then decided honesty was best. "Pastor Miller mentioned that people might be talking about you helping me," understanding dawned in Jackson's eyes. "Ah, I should have thought of that." "It's ridiculous," Grace said, surprising herself with the vehemence in her voice. "As if I haven't just lost my husband, as if I would." "People will always talk," Jackson said gently, "especially when there's little else to occupy their minds during the long winters." "Perhaps you shouldn't come anymore," Grace suggested, though the words pained her to say. Jackson was quiet for a long moment. "Is that what you want?" The question hung between them. Grace looked at him, really looked at him. The sun caught in his dark hair, highlighting strands of copper she hadn't noticed before. His eyes were patient, waiting for her answer. "No," she admitted softly, "but I don't want to damage your reputation either." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "My reputation can withstand a bit of gossip, but if it concerns you, I could speak to Henderson about hiring you a proper hand for the winter. Someone older, perhaps, or a married man." The thought of a stranger replacing Jackson made Grace's heart sink. "Let me think on it," she said finally. They parted ways, Jackson continuing toward town while Grace returned to her empty cabin. She moved through her evening routine, mechanically feeding the chickens, tending the stove, preparing a solitary meal she had little appetite for. That night, as she sat beside the empty bed that had been Thomas's, running her fingers over the quilt they had shared, Grace allowed herself to acknowledge the truth she'd been avoiding. She looked forward to Jackson's visits not just for the help he provided, but for his company. For the way his presence filled the silence that threatened to swallow her whole. The realization brought with it a wave of guilt so powerful it left her gasping. It had been barely 2 weeks since they'd laid Thomas in the ground. What kind of woman was she to find comfort in another man's presence so soon? Grace didn't sleep that night. By dawn, she had made her decision. When Jackson arrived, she met him on the porch, her spine straight, her resolve firm. "I appreciate all you've done, Mr. Garrett," she said formally, "but I believe it's best if you don't continue working here." Jackson's expression revealed nothing, but his knuckles whitened where he gripped his hat. "I understand, Mrs. Whitaker, if that's what you want." "It is," Grace lied, her voice steady despite the ache in her chest. Jackson nodded once, replaced his hat, and mounted his horse without another word. Grace watched him ride away, telling herself the hollow feeling spreading through her was relief, not regret. The days grew shorter, the nights colder. Grace struggled to maintain the property alone. Her hands, once soft from the relative luxury of Philadelphia society, grew calloused and chapped from work. She fell into exhausted sleep each night, too tired even to feel lonely. November brought the first heavy snow earlier than usual. Grace woke to find drifts piled against her door and windows, the world transformed into a white wilderness. She spent hours clearing a path to the barn, her lungs burning with each breath of frigid air. The cattle needed extra care in the cold. As Grace trudged through knee-deep snow to bring them feed, she slipped on a hidden patch of ice. Pain shot through her ankle as she fell. For a moment, she lay stunned in the snow, the silence of the winter day pressing against her ears. "Get up," she told herself fiercely. "Get up or die here." Somehow, she managed to drag herself back to the cabin, each step agony. By the time she reached the porch, her dress was sodden with melted snow, her teeth chattering uncontrollably. Inside, she assessed the damage. Her ankle was already swelling, the skin turning an angry purple. Not broken, she thought, but badly sprained. She bound it tightly with strips torn from an old sheet, but the reality of her situation was inescapable. She couldn't work the ranch like this. Night fell early, bringing with it a wind that howled around the eaves of the cabin like a living thing. Grace huddled beneath blankets, the fire dying in the stove as she lacked the strength to add more wood. As darkness claimed her, her last coherent thought was of Jackson's face, the warmth in his eyes when he smiled. She woke to the sound of her door opening. Disoriented, fevered, Grace reached for Thomas's old rifle beside the bed. "Who's there?" she called, her voice weak. "It's me, Grace." "Jackson?" Relief washed over her, followed immediately by confusion. "How did you?" "Henderson sent me to check on all the outlying properties after the storm," he explained, moving to her bedside. His face grew grave as he took in her condition. "You're burning up, my ankle," Grace managed. "I fell." Jackson's examination was gentle but thorough. "It's infected," he said, his voice tight with concern. "How long has it been like this?" Grace tried to remember. 2 days, 3. "I need to get you to a doctor." "Can't ride," Grace murmured, darkness creeping at the edges of her vision. "I'll take you in the wagon, but first I need to warm this place up." Grace drifted in and out of consciousness as Jackson moved around the cabin, building up the fire, heating water, preparing broth that he coaxed her to sip. His efficiency spoke of practice caring for the sick or injured. "Where did you learn to do all this?" she asked as he changed the compress on her forehead. A shadow crossed Jackson's face. "During the war, I was with the 7th Cavalry." He didn't elaborate, and Grace didn't press. By morning, her fever had broken, but the ankle remained hot and swollen. Jackson fashioned a makeshift stretcher to carry her to the wagon, which he had prepared with blankets and straw for insulation against the cold. "The cattle," Grace protested weakly as he lifted her. "I've seen to them," Jackson assured her, "and I'll come back to check on them daily." The journey to town was a blur of pain and cold. Grace clung to consciousness by focusing on Jackson's steady presence beside her. the sound of his voice as he spoke softly to the horses, encouraging them through the drifted snow. Doc Simmons took one look at Grace's ankle and shook his head. Nasty infection. Good thing you brought her in when you did, Garrett. Another day and she might have lost the foot. The doctor's small house became Grace's world for the next week as she fought the infection with poultices and medicine that smelled of herbs and alcohol. Jackson visited daily, bringing news of her ranch and the town's happenings. People are talking again, Grace said during one of his visits, her voice stronger now that the fever had fully subsided. Let them, Jackson replied with a shrug. Though I reckon we've given them plenty to chew on this time. Despite the pain and discomfort, Grace found herself smiling more in that week than she had in months. Jackson had a quiet humor that drew her out of herself, stories of his travels that transported her far from her sick. On the 7th day, Doc Simmons declared her fit to return home, though she would need to stay off her ankle for at least another week. Someone will need to help you, the doctor said, looking pointedly at Jackson. I can hire someone, Grace began, but Jackson interrupted, no need. I've already spoken to Henderson. He's given me leave to look after Mrs. Whitaker's place until she's back on her feet. The doctor nodded approvingly. Good man. Grace might have protested further, but the relief of not having to face her solitary cabin was overwhelming. The weeks of isolation had taken a toll she was only now beginning to recognize. Jackson had prepared the wagon again for their return journey, this time with a proper bed made of quilts and pillows borrowed from the doctor's wife. As they traveled, Grace watched his profile against the winter sky, wondering at the turns her life had taken. Why are you doing all this? She asked finally. You hardly knew me before Thomas died. Jackson was silent for so long that Grace thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost lost beneath the creak of the wagon wheels. I knew Thomas better than you might think, he said. We served together briefly during the war before he headed east. When I heard he'd settled in these parts, I made a point to find him. He paused. He was a good man, one of the few who showed kindness to a young soldier far from home. Grace absorbed this new information, this connection she hadn't known existed. He never mentioned knowing you. Some men don't talk about the war, Jackson said simply, but when he took ill, he sent for me. Asked me to look out for you if, when the time came. The revelation struck Grace like a physical blow. Thomas asked you to help me, and you never said, would you have accepted my help if you'd known? Jackson glanced at her, his expression unreadable. Grace considered the question honestly. Probably not, she admitted. I was too proud, too determined to prove I could manage alone. That's what Thomas said you'd say, Jackson replied, a hint of a smile touching his lips. He knew you well. They lapsed into silence as the wagon crested the final hill before her property came into view. Smoke rose from the cabin chimney. Jackson had clearly ridden ahead earlier to prepare for her return. It looks different, Grace observed as they drew closer. The yard was neat, the woodpile stacked high against the side of the house. Henderson sent over a couple of hands to help get things in order, Jackson explained. Thought it might ease your mind to come back to a place that was running smoothly. Gratitude welled in Grace's chest, nearly overwhelming in its intensity. Thank you, she whispered. Jackson helped her inside, where she found the cabin warm and welcoming. A pot of stew simmered on the stove, filling the air with rich, savory aromas. Fresh baking sat cooling on the table. Mrs. Henderson sent the bread, Jackson explained, settling Grace in a chair with her injured foot elevated on a stool. Said every home needs the smell of fresh bread. It's too much, Grace protested weakly, even as she felt tears threatening. Jackson knelt before her, his eyes serious. Grace, listen to me. You don't have to do everything alone. No one out here does. We all lean on each other from time to time. It's how we survive. His words broke something open inside her, the dam of self-reliance she'd built since Thomas's death, perhaps even before, when his illness had forced her to take on more and more responsibility. Tears spilled down her cheeks, unchecked. I don't know how to accept help, she confessed. I've been standing on my own for so long. Jackson's hand covered hers, warm and steadying. Then let me teach you. The days that followed established a new routine. Jackson slept in the barn, coming to the cabin at dawn to build up the fire before heading out to tend the cattle and other chores. Grace, confined to the house by her healing ankle, turned her attention to indoor tasks she'd neglected in her grief-mending clothes, organizing Thomas's belongings, writing long overdue letters to acquaintances back east. They shared meals together, conversation flowing more easily with each passing day. Grace learned that Jackson had grown up in Virginia, the son of a horse breeder, that he joined the Union Army at 18, driven by convictions his family hadn't shared, that he'd wandered west after the war, unable to return to a home that no longer existed. In turn, she told him of her childhood in Philadelphia, her dream of becoming a teacher before she'd met Thomas at a cousin's wedding. How she'd scandalized her parents by marrying a man with Western ambitions and little fortune to his name. "Do you regret it?" Jackson asked one evening as they sat before the fire. Coming west with him? Grace considered the question, watching the flames dance over the logs. "No," she said finally. "It was hard, especially at first, but I've never felt more alive than I do here, never felt more real." She looked up at him. "Does that make sense?" "Perfect sense," Jackson replied, his gaze warm on hers. As December deepened, Grace's ankle healed enough for her to move about with the aid of a cane Jackson had carved for her. The first time she made it to the barn to see the cattle, the sense of accomplishment was enormous. "They look good," she observed, running a hand over the flank of her favorite heifer. "They're sturdy stock," Jackson replied. Like their mistress, Grace laughed, the sound surprising her with its genuineness. "Is that a compliment, Mr. Garrett?" "The highest I know how to give, Mrs. Whitaker," he returned, his eyes crinkling at the corners. The moment held between them, something unspoken passing in the air. Then Grace looked away, suddenly conscious of her worn dress, her hair hastily pinned up that morning. "I should get back to the house," she said, her voice not quite steady. "There's bread to bake." Jackson simply nodded, but as he helped her navigate the snowy path back to the cabin, his hand at her elbow felt like more than just physical support. Christmas approached with a flurry of activity in the small community. Grace found herself invited to quilting circles and baking gatherings she'd previously avoided in her grief. To her surprise, the other women welcomed her warmly, their earlier gossip seemingly forgotten. "Jackson Garrett's a good man," Mrs. Henderson told her as they worked side by side rolling out pie crusts for the church social. "My Albert says he's the most reliable hand he's ever hired." "He's been very kind," Grace replied carefully. The older woman gave her a knowing look. "Kind isn't the word most would use for a man who spends his nights in a cold barn when there's a warm house available." Heat flooded Grace's cheeks. "It wouldn't be proper, Mrs. Henderson scoffed. "Child, there's nothing proper about a young woman trying to run a ranch alone in Montana territory. There's just survival." She patted Grace's hand, leaving a dusting of flour. "And there's no shame in finding happiness again. Thomas would want that for you." Grace said nothing, but the words stayed with her, turning over and over in her mind as Christmas Eve approached. The night before Christmas, a particularly vicious storm blew in, rattling the windows and sending snow swirling in spirals that obscured the view to the barn. Grace paced the cabin, worry gnawing at her as she imagined Jackson out in the bitter cold. When a knock finally came at the door, she flung it open to find him snow-covered and stamping his boots. "The north fence came down again," he reported, unwinding his scarf. "Fixed it temporary, but we'll need to rebuild that section come spring." Grace echoed. Jackson paused in the act of removing his coat. "Figure of speech," he said after a moment. "Habit." Grace took his coat, hanging it by the fire to dry. "I made stew," she said, "and there's apple cake." Jackson's smile was tired but genuine. "Sounds like heaven after fighting that wind." They ate in companionable silence, the storm's howl providing a constant backdrop. Jackson's eyes kept drifting closed, exhaustion evident in the slump of his shoulders. "You can't go back to the barn tonight," Grace said finally. "Not in this weather." Jackson straightened, suddenly alert. "I'll be fine, I've slept through worse." "Don't be ridiculous," Grace insisted. "You'll freeze to death, and then what would I do?" A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Worried about me, Mrs. Whitaker?" "Yes," she admitted simply. The directness of her answer seemed to catch him off guard. He studied her face, searching for something. Whatever he saw there made his expression soften. "Where would you have me sleep?" he asked quietly. Grace's gaze drifted to the empty bed that had been Thomas's, the bed she still sat beside each night before retiring to the small cot she'd set up for herself in the corner. "The bed is just gathering dust," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jackson followed her gaze, understanding dawning in his eyes. "Grace, I couldn't, please," she interrupted. "I haven't been able to sleep there since he died. It should be used by someone." For a long moment, Jackson was silent, the crackling of the fire the only sound in the cabin. Then he nodded slowly. "If you're sure." That night, as Grace lay on her cot in the corner, listening to Jackson's steady breathing from across the room, she felt something inside her begin to shift. The grief that had been her constant companion for months seemed less oppressive somehow, as if sharing her space, her life with another living soul had begun to dilute its power. Christmas Day dawned clear and blindingly bright, the storm having blown itself out during the night. Grace woke to the smell of coffee and bacon, finding Jackson already up and cooking at the stove. "Merry Christmas," he said, a hint of shyness in his greeting. "Merry Christmas," she returned, suddenly conscious of her nightgown and hastily wrapped shawl. After breakfast, Jackson surprised her by producing a small package wrapped in brown paper and string. "It's not much," he said as she unwrapped it to reveal a beautifully carved wooden brooch in the shape of a prairie rose. "Made it myself during the evenings." Grace traced the delicate petals with her finger, emotion tightening her throat. "It's beautiful," she managed, "but I haven't anything for you." "You've given me plenty," Jackson said softly. "A warm place to sleep last night, good food, company." Grace impulsively reached for his hand. "Stay," she said. "Not just in the barn, here in the house, at least until winter breaks." Jackson's fingers tightened around hers. "People will talk." "Let them," Grace replied, echoing his own words from weeks before. "I'm tired of being alone." That evening, as they sat before the fire sharing stories of Christmases past, Grace found herself studying Jackson's profile. The firelight cast golden highlights on his features, softening the lines that hard work and harder experiences had etched there. "What?" he asked, catching her gaze. "I was just thinking," Grace said slowly, "about how different this Christmas is from what I expected." "Better or worse?" "Different," she repeated, then, more softly, "Better, I think." Jackson set aside his coffee cup and turned to face her fully. "Grace, there's something I need to say." Her heart quickened at the seriousness in his tone. "Yes, I made a promise to Thomas that I'd look after you," he began, "and I intend to keep that promise for as long as you need me to." "I'm grateful," Grace started, but Jackson shook his head. "Please, let me finish." "This is difficult enough." He took a deep breath. "The thing is, somewhere along the way, my reasons for staying changed. It wasn't just about a promise anymore." Grace sat very still, hardly daring to breathe. "I know it's too soon," Jackson continued. "I know you're still grieving. But I want you to know that if you ever decide you're ready for more than just a hired hand or a friend, I'll be here." His eyes, earnest and vulnerable, held hers. "If you'll have me." The words hung in the air between them, weighted with possibility. Grace thought of Thomas, of the life they'd shared, the dreams they'd built. She thought of the empty bed and the lonely days. And she thought of Jackson's steady presence, the way he'd brought light back into her world when she'd thought it extinguished forever. "I don't know when I'll be ready," she said honestly. "But I know that I'm grateful every day that you came into my life." Jackson nodded, accepting her words for the promise they were. "Then I'll wait," he said simply. The winter passed in a rhythm of work and quiet evenings. Jackson moved permanently into the cabin, though he maintained a respectful distance, sleeping in the small room they'd converted from a storage space. Together, they weathered storms, nursed sick cattle, and planned for spring planting. By March, when the first hints of green began to emerge from beneath the melting snow, Grace realized something fundamental had changed. The widow who had sat beside an empty bed, paralyzed by grief, had been replaced by a woman who looked forward to each new day, who found joy in simple moments shared with a man who asked for nothing but gave everything. One evening, as they walked the property assessing winter damage, they paused at the small fenced plot where Thomas lay buried. Grace placed the first wildflowers of the season on the simple marker, Jackson standing respectfully behind her. "I miss him," she said, her voice clear in the spring air. "I always will, but I'm not just surviving anymore, I'm living again." Jackson's hand found hers, tentative at first, then sure when she twined her fingers with his. "That's all he would have wanted for you," he said softly. Grace turned to face him, seeing in his eyes the same emotion that had been growing in her heart through the long winter months. "And what about what you want, Jackson?" A smile touched his lips. "I think you know the answer to that, Grace." That night, as they sat before the fire as they had done countless times before, Grace gathered her courage and crossed the invisible boundary that had existed between them. She took Jackson's hand and led him to the bed that had stood empty for so long. "Grace," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "are you certain?" In answer, she reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "The widow sat beside an empty bed," she said softly, "and the cowboy said, 'It's time you slept beside me instead.'" Jackson's arms encircled her, drawing her close. "I've been waiting to hear those words," he murmured against her hair. "I know," Grace replied, her heart full as she lifted her face to his. "I'm sorry it took me so long to say them." His kiss was gentle, reverent, a beginning rather than an ending. As Grace melted into his embrace, she felt the last shadows of grief recede, replaced by the warm certainty that love, like the Montana spring, could emerge even after the harshest winter. By summer's end, Grace Whitaker became Grace Garrett in a simple ceremony beneath the cottonwood trees by the creek. The community that had once whispered behind their hands now celebrated the union, understanding better than most the necessity of finding joy where one could in a land that demanded so much. Together, they built a life on the foundation of mutual respect and shared purpose. The ranch flourished under their combined care, and in time, the sound of children's laughter joined the rhythm of their days. The bed that had once stood empty became the heart of a home filled with love, a testament to the resilience of the human heart and its capacity for renewal, even in the harshest of territories.